Hello, my name is Wendy Saline. I'm the Dean of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, and it's with great pleasure today that I introduce this program that is the first in a series of events recognizing the 90th anniversary of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. Our institute was established in 1932, and it was only the third psychoanalytic institute established in the United States. So for this occasion, in each month, we're going to be introducing different facets of the Institute, and we'll be recording these programs and making them available on our website. If the pandemic eases, we hope we can also meet in person. So today, we're bringing together two former directors and the current president of our Institute for a conversation about the place of the Chicago Institute in the field of psychoanalysis and in the Chicago community, and a consideration of the traditions of the Institute and some thoughts about looking forward. We've had 11 directors and presidents over the last 90 years. I'd just like to name them. Franz Alexander, Gerhard Piers, George Pollack, Henry Seidenberg, Arnold Goldberg, Thomas Papadis, Jerome Weiner, David Terman, Robert Gordon, Phil Lebovitz, and Erika Schmidt. And I would like to introduce the three discussants in order of their tenure. David Terman, MD, who was our director from 2004 to 2010. Phil Lebovitz MD, who was the director from 2011 to 2013. And Erika Schmidt, president of the Institute from 2013 to 2022 in the present. So when Franz Alexander founded the Institute in 1932, he made a commitment not only to training psychoanalysts, but also to scholarship and research. And these have all been important aspects of the Institute since then. Under Pierce in the 1960s, the teacher education program and the child therapy program began, and these expanded the training mission of the Institute to include teachers, although we no longer do that, and child therapists. Later, an adult therapy program began. Clinical services began with an evaluation service for low-fee psychoanalysis and has since expanded to serve children, adolescents, and adults in psychotherapy. And now our mission includes 4 certificate granting programs, our Fundamentals Year program, our Psychoanalytic Education and Psychoanalysis for Scholars and Professionals program, our Psychodynamic Psychotherapy program, and our Exploring Psychoanalysis program. And in addition, we have the Treatment Center, which provides free adjusted psychotherapy to children, adolescents, and adults, along with group and individual services on site and in schools. Phil, beginning with you, would you please talk about research at the Institute? I'm thinking of the many projects that you've been involved with in the past, but perhaps you could say something about the psychosomatic specificity research, psychotherapy research, parent loss, and outcome studies.
Oh, happily. The research history of our institute goes almost back to the beginning. One of the most famous ones is the psychosomatic specificity research, which involved Franz Alexander, Thomas French, George Pollack, and a few others. And that really dominated the field until probably the 1960s, when more rigorous kinds of statistical research was done, and it cast a lot of doubt on some of the conclusions that came from that research. Other kinds of research that came from that period were a parent loss study that involved a former dean, Joanne Fleming, another former dean, Henry Seidenberg, an associate dean of Seidenberg's, Saul Altschul, names that might not be familiar to a lot of people. But the essential finding of the parent loss research, which was based on analyses of adults who had lost parents when they were young children, was that there was a kind of developmental arrest that occurred when the parent was lost to the child at the young age of the child, and that in the course of treatment, what was necessary, important, essential even, was to deal with the issues involving the surviving parent before the effect of the loss of the parent at the young age could really be dealt with, and often result in resumed mourning, or if not resumed, mourning in the first place for that person to process it, and hopefully then resume a developmental course that would be productive. There's some other research that's been done in recent years. One group with Jorge Schneider leading it has been to look at what the experience is of people as they go through training and complete training, and what are some of the indicators of successful training or successful careers after training. Another research that's been going on for over 40 years now was started by Nate Schlesinger and Fred Robbins, and has been called the assessment of change in the process of treatment. And that's one of the things that's been very near and dear to my heart, and which I've tried to continue and carry on in the tradition of Nate Schlesinger and Fred Robbins. And the research involves interviewing patients that have successfully completed treatment by both the judgment of the patient and the analyst, and to interview them at least 2 years after they've completed treatment.
Well, thank you, Phil. David, could you discuss the role of education and training at the Institute over the years?
Well, I would like to add on to what Phil has talked about. We have a very, very distinguished history at the Institute, and I think we would be really seriously amiss if we didn't talk about the development and the contributions of self-psychology. And I'd like to talk about that, if I might, because Phil has, outlined all the wonderful research that we've had, and in addition to all of that, we've developed a new psychoanalytic paradigm, for God's sake. And this is an incredible development, an incredible phenomenon. I happened to be a candidate. Actually, I started in 1965, only 33 years after the institute was founded. So I've been around for a good part of its history, indeed. It so happened that in 1966, Heinz Kohut began teaching our class his developing ideas about what it meant to be a self, or what factors were responsible for a very central development in human human psyche and human experience. I was, of course, absolutely fascinated and transfixed by these ideas, as I had been the previous year, where it was the last year that he taught classical psychoanalytic theory, and I was equally amazed at the scope of his understanding of classical psychoanalytic theory. In any event, he then began to teach our class for 4 years that followed. And I became, of course, immersed in self-psychology, as well as getting training in classical theory. But what I immediately realized, or almost immediately realized, was that this was a new paradigm. That classical psychoanalytic theory, as enormously important and fundamental as it was and is, really saw development more or less like one would think about an embryological development. That is, that all the factors were there at the beginning, and then there was an unfolding of those factors, with the environment playing a very subordinate role in the development of those factors. What self-psychology did was say, development isn't just everything is there at the beginning, but is a function of the transactions of the relationships that the child has in his or her development, and that those relationships are central to the understanding of who the child is, what the child becomes, and what the difficulties were. And when you factor in the understanding of those relationships within the so-called self-object, that is where the parents or others form a psychological functions for the child, when you factor those in, you have a very different kind of understanding of who the child was, what happened, and what happens in the analytic process. And I think this is the only alternative paradigm, it seems to me. Well, I don't know about the only, but it's one of the central, most important paradigms in psychoanalysis. And it happened here in Chicago, by golly. I've always been impressed with the depth and directness of clinical experience at the Chicago Institute. And I think this is a very long tradition. And having been here for more than half of the Institute's life, I can speak from personal experience. Chicago has always been one of the most rigorous institutes in the country. We took our teaching very seriously. We had classes, every other weekend, so that people from around the country could come in and participate. And we had a very thorough curriculum, as well as an exam, a paper, exam and a paper, a termination, and 4 controls. We modified that in recent years somewhat, but the rigorousness and the completeness of education in Chicago, I think, was quite notable. Joanne Fleming, by the way, deserves a lot of credit for that. But these are rich and important traditions, and have borne fruit in the development of a new paradigm, and in the research that Phil has cited. We should be very proud.
Hey, Erika, would you like to talk about the work of the clinics and the treatment center?
I'd be delighted to. Just like with our education programs and our research, our clinics go back also to 1932 and Franz Alexander. When Franz Alexander was contemplating taking the position as director of the Chicago Institute, he wrote a letter to the board, or the board that was forming the institute, talking about his experiences in Berlin. And many people may know, but Franz Alexander was one of the star students in Berlin in the 1920s. He was admired by Freud. He was an eminent teacher in the early days of the Berlin Institute, and a contributor to scholarship in Berlin for sure. And when he was invited to come to the Chicago Institute, he wrote a letter. And one of the things that he described in this letter was the way that Berlin had formed clinics to provide psychoanalysis to people who couldn't afford it otherwise. And he combined his ideas about clinics with his commitment to research and to the furthering of psychoanalysis as a science. And one of the things that he said in this letter that I think really rings true to me is that the clinics in Berlin, he said, were one of the great moral assets of the Berlin Institute, and he wanted to bring those to Chicago as well. So from the time that Alexander came here, there were clinics in Chicago, and these clinics were designed in part to attract people for his research projects, including the psychosomatic specificity research. And there were patients who came to the clinics and were also part of his research project. But that's where our clinics started. And then over the years, they've really evolved. I believe that the Institute always had a clinic or some form a low-fee referral service for psychoanalytic patients. And that has continued from early days up until now. And as Phil was saying, there was a very significant research project on parent loss that, again, grew out of, as David emphasized, it grew out of clinical practice, because what adult analysts recognized was that they had patients in analysis who'd suffered a loss as a child, and they were particularly challenging to treat. And so the question arose, if we provided services for them when they were children, would that have helped them navigate the challenges of adult life more effectively? And in order to demonstrate our commitment to that idea, that notion of early intervention, what formed was what was initially called the Barr-Harris Children's Grief Services. It was supported by Irving Harris and George Barr. And the idea was to provide clinical services to children who had lost a parent, initially through death, and then it expanded to through divorce or death. And then it gradually evolved as people recognized the variety of kinds of losses that children experience, separations from parents who were incarcerated, for example, or who are in the military. So that the Barr-Harris Children's Grief Services, which is now called Child Grief Services, evolved out of our research project, and it remains a really strong area of our clinical expertise today. So that was a clinic, and then one of our staff people recognized that when people came to the clinic to be evaluated for a low-fee psychoanalysis, sometimes people weren't ready for an analysis. They weren't in a life situation that would enable them to take advantage of an analysis. And those people were referred to psychotherapists for service. And the light bulb went off for somebody who said, well, why don't we provide clinical services within our institute for these people who aren't, who were seeking an analysis but aren't ready or available for it at this time. And from there, our clinic for adults grew and grew and grew. And David knows a lot about this because a lot of it happened during your tenure. And then in 2008, so now we have our child grief services, we have an adult clinic, low-fee clinic. And in 2008, there was a third clinical service that was added. And I was given the honor of being invited to be the first director of that clinic for child and adolescent clinical services, again, under David's tenure as director. And the idea of this clinic was that children and adolescents who couldn't afford regular private practice fees are entitled to the same quality of service that they would if they could have afforded a private practitioner. And it was the goal of that clinic to provide high quality mental health services to children and adolescents, regardless of their family's resources. And that clinic began in 2008 and it continues to this day. I guess it was during the early days of my role as leader of the Institute, a strategic planning process was underway. And one of the recommendations out of that strategic planning process was that we combined the three clinical services that had grown up in kind of separate ways with their separate ways of doing things. We had an adult clinic, a child clinic, and we had grief services for children. And the idea was that we should align those services so that their policies and procedures work together systematically so that we could present a more coherent public face to our public audience, to potential patients for that clinic. And we, about 2 years ago, aligned the 3 clinical services into what we're calling into what we call our treatment center. So 1 treatment center, 3 clinical services. We've also developed an array of services that are provided on site in schools to children in schools. And some of those services are group work services, some are individual services. And it has really enabled us to meet children in a school system and have access to them in a way that, and they have access to us in a way that they might not if they had had to come to an office on a weekly or twice weekly basis. And those school services have also had a huge impact, both in terms of being able to work with the schools, being able to work in small groups, being able to work with teachers and administrators in schools.
Would you say too that the providing the quality clinical services as we have, as you have, as our clinic has, is also an opportunity to learn and to increase our scholarship. This is another area for our scholarship and our deepening understanding of the human condition. Wouldn't you say that we are able to reach a greater segment of the population this way than we would have simply out of our private practice?
I think that's absolutely right, David. And I think that the other thing that it has really brought home to me is the way in which psychoanalysis is really relevant, no matter where you are.
Yet another thing that proves that psychoanalysis is unique, irreplaceable, and uniquely valuable for the human race, I think.
Yes.
Right, because it's about people.
An indication of just how valuable and important our clinic is the pandemic project, which we started just in the last year and a half. And without the foundation of our clinic, that project would have really just faltered and disappeared. But as a result of what the clinic could provide, we were able to offer 8 free, I suppose the best term is pro bono sessions, to all kinds of frontline personnel, physicians, nurses, social workers, paramedics, firemen, and so on.
Yeah, and Phil really initiated this project, and I think we were very fortunate to be able to support it through our clinic structure.
This year, the Institute celebrates its 90th anniversary, the year in which we will hopefully emerge more fully from the pandemic. We've seen so many changes in the multiplicity of theories, in the standards for training, in the way people practice, and the role of psychoanalysis in the wider world. So based on your experience running the Institute, along with your many years of practicing psychoanalysis, what do you think we should anticipate as the Institute heads towards its 100th anniversary? David, let's start with you.
Well, we're very bad. We're very good at reconstructing the past. We're not very good at predicting the future, so I'm not sure what the next 10 years or more will bring. As I had said before, I do think that that psychoanalysis is irreplaceable, that it is unique. It's a unique avenue into the human experience. There's nothing that's close to it ever. And it has produced some central and important understandings of who we are. I think possibly there'll be more application to social processes. It's something that I've been interested in, as you may know, and helped publish a book about that, the fundamentalist mindset. I think there may be more investigation of social processes, and I think there should be also a further evolution of our theoretical constructs. I mean, we've got two valuable ones. That is the classical one, and I would, of course, have self-psychology. I I'm somewhat prejudiced about that, but I think it is a central and valuable paradigm. And but there's no end to that. And I think that hopefully we'll have further evolution of further paradigms, possibly with with integrating with neuroscience and some of the other and developmental studies, so that we can really have a coherent understanding of human experience. That is, if we survive. That is, if society survives. There are unfortunately factors in the world now which are very threatening to both civilization and democracy. And I think we can only exist if the civilization and our democracy survive. So I'm concerned about that. But if we can indeed continue to exist as a civilization, I think those might be some of the further developments that we may see.
Thank you, David. Bill?
Predicting the future is something that I love to try to do, and almost always I end up making predictions that never come true. So with that caveat, I'll make some anyway. One of them is that that psychoanalysis will become much more inclusive. And I think we're seeing elements of that in the way that we've been responding to some of our attitudes towards racism, and some of the ways in which panels and papers and other forms of discussion have taken place with some of our Black colleagues. That's one of the areas in which psychoanalysis must do more in the future, because we've had too few people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds compared to what we could do and what would be, I think, beneficial for them and for us. In addition to that, the cutting edge of the notion of what is sexuality is part of what we've been trying to grapple with. And that's something that will continue, I think, for quite a few years, because it's so controversial and so difficult to figure out a useful way of addressing it and understanding it and incorporating it into psychoanalytic theory. Related to that is what David was alluding to about social impact, and how we can be more involved and more recognized for that is something that I believe analysis will be endeavoring to do and will continue to do. One of the examples in which that was begun recently in the last few years was the group that published the book Duty to Warn, in which a variety of analysts were publicly speaking about public figures and what the public needed to understand about the personality of our leaders, and how that could be something that we would pay more attention to. One of the things that I'm cognizant of is that a number of years ago, a candidate for vice president was open about having had electroshock therapy treatment, and he was summarily dismissed from the ticket because of the prejudice toward treatment of mental illnesses. And I think that's something that's been altered and is continuing to be modified. But those of us that can be public spokespeople, that can appear on television shows or create podcasts or write papers and columns for papers, newspapers and magazines is another thing that would be part of our future. And I think we might see more of that happening. Lastly, which I think is crucial, is that research is something that we need to find a way not only to do, but to publicize, because there's a very robust group of researchers who are friendly toward psychoanalysis, if not psychoanalysts themselves. And that's one of the hidden gems of our profession, and is something that will, I think, become more prominent as we go further. But the importance of it for our institute is what I think can't be overemphasized, and how we can find a way to provide the foundation for doing research, both the committee structure and the grant development that would need to be done in order to support research, is something that I hope will be part of our future.
Thank you, Phil. Erika?
Yes. Well, first, let me endorse everything that David and Phil have both said. I would like, one thing I would like to emphasize is, I too remember Thomas Eagleton, was it? Yes, he was the VP candidate who was kicked off the ticket.
Yeah.
One thing that we've learned from the pandemic is that mental health isn't such a scary word anymore. And I think that that's, again, it's one of those funny silver linings of this terrible experience, is that mental health has become something that people are talking more about. People are acknowledging experiencing mental health difficulties. And I think that the more that that's in the sort of public awareness, I think the better. I think that what we're going to see is the way in which I hope psychoanalysis is infused into a lot of different kinds of social and cultural activities, and serves to help us understand social justice issues, cultural difficulties, cultural differences, and that we think about psychoanalysis as relevant to all of the places where you find people, because they bring their psyches with them. And I think the more that we as psychoanalysts can speak to that and help people understand that psychoanalysis is relevant, whether you're in somebody's office, or whether you're in a school, or whether you're in a neighborhood, or whether you're on a basketball court, it matters. And it's a way of understanding what happens. So I think, and I can't remember when this article was published, but Stuart Twemlow published an article called "Does the Future of Psychoanalysis Lie Beyond the Couch?" Now, I don't know that psychoanalytic practice is ever going to be given up. I don't think so, because I think it's such a rich way of understanding one's own life and ambitions. But I do think psychoanalysis has to move far beyond the couch, and I think we see that happening. I think our theories are in a kind of interesting state of growth and proliferation. I myself find it very difficult to think about just accepting a multiplicity of theories. I hope that there's some coherence that is made out of our theories in some way, and maybe there's a kind of meeting of the neurosciences with the humanistic sciences that will help us do that. So I think there's that too. But I think that, David commented that he was a little worried about the future for democracy. And it is very frightening to see the kinds of authoritarianism that's happening both on a really local level and on a worldwide level. I really think that one of the things, if democracy is to prevail, I think that our psychoanalytic values have to be acknowledged and encouraged. And when I say psychoanalytic values, I really mean, if I had to say one value that I think is really important, I think it's the primacy of individual subjectivity, that it matters. People's own feelings matter. They direct what they do and how they feel and how they interact in the world. And I think psychoanalysis, like nothing else, acknowledges the value of each individual subjectivity. There are a lot of other psychoanalytic values as well, but I think that's a really, really important one. And I think if democracy is going to prevail, people need to understand that and value it as well. And I think
Amen. Amen.
Understand that. I'll end there.
Thank you all so much. I can imagine this conversation going on for several hours more and continuing to be very interesting. This has been enlightening and also heartening. Hearing how you all confronted challenges during your tenures and helped to bring both our institute and the study and work of psychoanalysis to another level. We owe you all a debt of gratitude for your work. Thank you.